Hello, good afternoon, or morning, or evening, of course. So I did a recording while I was sitting outside, with the plants and the plants were moving, that red chair. I was sitting in there, but my computer and my data and my Wi-Fi, they all said no. Professor Bloom, you are not going to sit in that chair and do a video and do a voice recording on top of it. So I took a picture of the garden, and what I wanted to do was to read you some of the Psychology of Gardening book by Harriet Gross. So I'm going to read about 6 minutes, I think, and then I'll stop reading. So I'm going to do excerpts to make it move a little more quickly than if I just read every word. Okay. To paraphrase, this is chapter 2 called It's My Little Bit of Paradise, What Your Garden Says About You. And Harriet Gross starts out saying that she was given pictures of 5 gardens and asked to pick out personality traits of the 5 gardeners. And those 5 gardeners had taken a little personality inventory. And it turned out in one case she was spot on with all the traits by looking at someone's garden, and that, 2 or 3 elements of each description submitted were close enough to make it seem a reasonable match. So what she's trying to set up here is this idea that one's garden does reflect one's inner world, one's personality, and even I think someone's cognitive structure, their need, although this could be a personality trait also, their need for order. So let me go on and let me pick up a place here. Okay, this chapter, so says Harriet Gross, examines the psychological value of gardening as a process of personalization. Using research on gardeners' experiences, the chapter explores how personality or identity might relate to people's engagement with gardening. Then she goes on, I'm skipping a little section. This section is called Ownership and Identity, Doing My Garden for Me. Interviews with gardeners and allotment holders testify to the personal creative activity that goes into producing a garden. Gardeners' personal preferences are achieved through plant choices, planting styles, and layout of the plot, as well as structures and objects in the garden. In their garden, people can express their commitment to sustainability, their environmental identity, through what they grow or what they do there. People have fond memories of their childhood gardens, and some have even had an idea of what they wanted their own garden to be like since they were children. And I was reflecting about that sentence, and I thought my favorite book, I think, when I was a child, was The Secret Garden. And I think it's a lot of people's favorite, but the idea of that enclosed garden that was all overgrown and the potential for such beauty, I think for me, it was a really powerful metaphor for my own kind of potential. Plus, it was a little girl in that story, and I think that helped me also to identify with it. Back to reading. People emphasize their plot's uniqueness or its personality and are pleased to claim their heritage, relationships, and experiences through their garden. Quote, my garden is the result of many influences, my foster parents, my foster sister, my slave ancestry, and my travels. When I filmed abroad, I brought back so many plants, in my mind at least. Similarly, immigrants to New Zealand from China said that bringing things from their country of origin into their gardens meant they were able to resolve some of the difficulties they faced being in a strange place. Doing this helped them to feel at home in their new location. In a sense, their gardens gave them access to their own past and the present, so they could see the future. They could see a future. In the process of making them more familiar, gardens come to hold meanings of place, identity, and relationships. So as you think about your own gardens, your own idea of what would be a perfect garden, try to reflect a bit about how it represents your own personal past, present, and future. Gardeners can be very clear about what they want to make their gardens personally meaningful, regardless of the effort involved. One person interviewed about their garden had such a passion for roses that his garden contained over 150 rose bushes. Somebody else had removed much of the planting and chopped down out of control trees in her small garden because it had been too grannified. Allotment holders construct their allotment spaces in ways which clearly reflect personal, local, and national ideals. So when you're doing your reflections and your writing in your final paper for using seeds in gardening, this idea of personal, local, and national ideals reflected in your own garden. I'm going to push ahead a bit. Making a garden that feels good seems to involve starting from scratch. People talk about starting from scratch or wishing they could start with a clean slate in their home garden or on their allotment. And again, I will jump ahead. Whatever individual garden style gardeners aspire to, garden experts distinguish between different forms and styles of garden related to the historic time, to the designer, and to the location. These can be divided into formal and informal styles. So as you know, there's a formal garden with, topiary, a manicured lawn, and so forth, versus two other types of gardens that she talks about here. Three different types, that you can use in your reflections and papers, called manicured, romantic, or wild. Now, as you look at my garden there, you might start to think in your head, well, what kind of gardening style? How would you identify looking at this gardening style? I just wanted to make sure that I'm getting close to 7 minutes. They asked 123 Dutch allotment gardeners whether they would describe their own garden as manicured, romantic, or wild. And they also measured these gardeners' need for structure. The gardeners with greater need for structure, and she calls it your higher PNS score, were more likely to classify their own garden as manicured and less likely to classify it as wild. So if I had a high need for structure, I would take my garden and compare to maybe what you would say this looks like, whether it looks structured or romantic or wild. If I or you had a high need for structure, we'd be more likely to identify this garden as being structured. Men in the study were nearly 3 times as likely to have a manicured style allotment garden than a wild one. The men's preference for manicured gardens mirrors earlier findings that showed older men in Sheffield, a town in England, were more likely to appreciate neatness and less likely to enjoy the opportunity to be creative in a garden. The need for structure is more about decisiveness and certainty rather than being tidy in itself. So it might be more about planning and achieving an idea for a garden. Designing a manicure garden is inevitably a creative process. More importantly, for the psychology of gardening, the study shows that the garden style people prefer is not simply a matter of personal taste, but motivated by important psychological needs. Possible implications that some of the benefits of gardening could be reduced if the style of garden someone has at home or on the allotment deviates from their own preferred structure. The need for structure may explain gardeners' desire to start from scratch, being a slash and burn gardener, to keep nature under control and to start afresh each year, rather than letting nature take its course, could result for a strong need for structure. So that to me is super interesting, and just for time's sake, when you're looking at my garden here, I personally, hopefully you've already had your thoughts about this, I don't care too much about structure. I don't find this to be wild. I do have a wild side garden that I'll take a picture of and show you for our next taping. So I hope that's given you enough to think about. And you can always just go back to the beginning, listen to it again, and write down some of these terms that I've used if you need them in any form. Okay, take good care. Thank you so much.